This week on Q&A, a look behind the new book by former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Currently on his book tour, Mr. Rumsfeld talks about the making of the book and responds to some reviews. He also looks back to a C-SPAN appearance 20 years ago, where he gave advice to presidents and their staffs.
Donald Rumsfeld, author of Known and Unknown. How did you write this book?
I decided to, first I thought about doing a quick one in a year and using basically my memory. Instead, I decided that I have such a rich archive that I've lived so many years, a third of our country's history, which is almost unbelievable. And I decided to digitize a lot of my papers and then use that. The second thing I did was I decided that I've read a lot of books by friends involving things that I'd been involved in, and it was a narrow perspective often. So I decided to bring in, I don't know how many people, 40 or 50 people, one at a time, who were involved with me at various segments of my life, and we'd sit in a conference room and tape it, and then transcribe it, and each stimulate the other one and talk about, remind each other of things that took place. And then we'd transcribe it. And then I also had, I had my parents' letters from World War II. I have all the memos when I met with Gerald Ford, the only president who wasn't elected, or vice president or president. I dictate a lot of memos on these old-fashioned dictaphones with the little tapes. And I had mountains of paper. And I did a lot of oral histories over the years. Each time I'd do some position-wise, some group would come and want to do an oral history. So I had this enormous archive. And we just started taking it and putting it together and then working it and working it and working it. And it took forever. It took 4 years to do this. But it's fun. I enjoyed it. Bill Safire said, you've got to enjoy it. So I just said, well, I'm going to expect that it'll take a long time, be a lot of work, and I'll just relax and enjoy it. And I have. I've had a chance to visit with a lot of old friends.
Where did you do it?
I did it mostly in Washington, where my archive is. But the more it got digitized, I could do it out at my home in New Mexico, or I could do it out in St. Michael's, Maryland.
Did you have someone kind of overseeing the whole thing for you?
As someone said the other day, I've got an army. I've got 3 key people who help me do all of it. And then I've had 5 or 6 other people who've been doing the fact-checking and research and transcribing and all of the mountain of work that it involves. So we probably had a team of 6, 7 people.
And how many days or hours collectively did you actually spend on it, do you think?
Oh, goodness. Well, for over 4 years.
Every day?
Most every day, probably be 5.5, 6 days a week.
Why did you want to spend all this time doing this?
Well, at first I didn't. At first I thought I'd do a short book, and then I decided that I had the time, I had the ability to digitize, which saves an enormous amount of time, and I decided that what I wanted to do was to try to write it for people who are interested in history, who are interested in government, serious people who would like to feel that they were there in the room when decisions were made and get a sense of the people and what the differences were or what the agreements were, how it worked. But the website that we created with these hundreds and hundreds of documents and thousands of pages, give a reader a chance to read the book, look at an endnote. There's something like 1,300 endnotes. Look at the endnote, and then go and see the entire memo. So if I've quoted a paragraph, they can go read the entire memorandum and see, well, that's interesting. That's what the context and the perspective was. And I guess partly I wanted to do it because I'm able to do it. I have the time, and I have the archive and the interest. And I'd never done it before. I mean, many people have written books. I have never written a book.
Who paid for all this? Staff and everything? Out of your own pocket?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So on the website, where did you get this idea? And has it ever been done before that you know of?
Not that I know of. I'm sure there's somebody who must have done it, but what we've done is we've taken all of these primary source documents, things in large measure I've written for whatever reason over so many decades, and digitized them, and then you can research it. You can go in and look by keyword or name or date, and so I think that the book is rooted in the archive, and it is what it is. It says what happened, I think.
I know when I got on, I could type in names of people that I've known and it would come up. But I guess, and you just said this, that you could actually click on a letter or an article on the endnotes, which I don't think I've ever seen before.
Yeah.
And as you'll see, I'm going to read back to you some of the things that people have written. They've even used your own endnotes against you.
Sure. Oh, exactly. It's inevitable. If you're going to put that much out there, someone's going to find something, and of course, a lot of it's never read by me. It was never edited. There'll be misspellings. There'll be names wrong, but these were working documents. These were things that actually were part of how things worked.
What do you think it cost you?
Oh goodness, I don't know. It's cost quite a bit. Fortunately, life's been good. I've spent 20 years in the private sector, and I've been able to do that.
Would it cost you $500,000, $1 million, you think?
I don't want to guess.
But a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
What do you hope to get from this?
I hope to have produced a book, which I think I have, that will interest people in public service, that will inform serious people about how decisions are made and the fact that those are tough jobs and that the people in them are honorable people, and that they have to make decisions with imperfect information inevitably. I hope they'll have a glimpse of what the times that I've lived have been, this third of our country's history. I think of it, I was serving in Congress during the Vietnam War and during the civil rights marches and the times when the city of Washington, D.C. was in flames after Martin Luther King was assassinated. They'll get a sense of the fact that President Lyndon Johnson could barely leave the White House for periods because of the demonstrators against the war in Vietnam. We all have a tendency to think of the times we're living in as somewhat unique and distinctive, and of course they're different. But in my 78 years, I've seen an awful lot of turmoil in the country and difficulties in the country. I must say, I also hope that people will read this and see how important the all-volunteer military's been. If you think about it, back in the 60s, before President Nixon, and Milton Friedman and a whole group of people had a push for a volunteer army, and President Nixon managed to get it through the Congress. Before that, there were people serving who didn't want to serve in our military. Everyone today is there because they want to. Every single person is there because they put up their hand and said, I want to do this. I'm a volunteer. Send me. And the mood in the country is so different as a result of that. Compared to the Vietnam War, today, what's going on in Iraq or Afghanistan, the American people are proud of the military, and the military are proud of what they're doing, and they know what they're doing, and they know why they're doing it, which is why I decided I wanted the proceeds from the book, my proceeds, to go to the men and women in uniform and their families who also serve, and to the children of the fallen, and that's what'll happen to the proceeds.
If you get on the Donald Rumsfeld Foundation website, you see that you have somewhere around $10 million in the foundation, maybe more by now. But you see that you've given money away, scholarship money away. Mm-hmm. How do you choose those people? How much of that have you done, and why are you doing that?
I've had people work for me in government who never could have gotten a master's or a PhD. On their own. And there was a foundation that was supporting that type of thing for people who needed the assistance. And Joyce and I decided, my wife Joyce, that we would give some money each year. And we have spotters around the country at 10, 12, 15 different universities who make recommendations to us. And then we select them and provide the funds they need, the tuition and stipends they need to be able to, particularly people who are interested in public service. These are people who are studying things like economics or government or international affairs and things that relate to government, with the thought that maybe someday they'll participate in helping to guide and direct our country.
Go back to the book itself. How much of it did you personally write?
Well, I wrote a lot, and I don't know quite how to answer it because I dictated. So what I would do is dictate, and then it would be transcribed, and then our team of people would work it and fact check it and recast it, and then I suppose I've been over every word in it somewhere between 15 and 20 times, editing and editing and editing, which is what I do. We took some of the material were things that I dictated years ago, and cables and memorandum and the likes.
I don't want to. The simple question: are you tired of this? Writing it and talking it. I've seen you on Fox several times. I've seen you on ABC. I've seen you on CBS. I read a lot of interviews in USA Today and other publications. Is this getting old?
No, it's not at all. I enjoyed doing it, as I said, and if one looks in the book, I think it's clear that I feel very fortunate to have been able to serve in government over in so many different roles over so many decades, and I find it interesting. I also have never written a book before, and the thing I've always enjoyed in life most is learning, and this has been an opportunity for me to learn, which makes it particularly interesting. I think if you do something over and over and over again, probably it can get a little tiring, but I've never written a book, and it's been a challenge. We've put together this wonderful team of people, and worked hard on it, and enjoyed it, and I'm enjoying having a chance to talk a bit about the book and how we did it and why we did it.
You told Fred Barnes in the Weekly Standard that you called 7 people before this book was published to tell them what to expect in it, and maybe you wrote 20 others.
I did.
Explain that, and why did you call them, and who did you call?
Well, I remember calling President Bush and Vice President Cheney and Colin Powell and Condi Rice and Jerry Bremer, maybe 1 or 2 others. And then I sent it out to an awful lot of the memo, a separate memo out to a lot of people. And the reason I did it is because this has not been done before, that suddenly there's going to be this website, which exists now, Rumsfeld.com, where someone can go in and people will go in. They are going in large numbers. And I thought the people ought to know that their names are in some of these memos, and I didn't want them to be surprised. I told all of them I doubted if there was a single memo in there that referenced them that they hadn't already seen. I mean, it would be something that I had sent to them earlier, or they'd sent to me, or where we were discussing something. So I don't think there would be any surprises. The only surprise would be that suddenly a whole bunch of people unknown to me or to them would be going into the website and seeing these memos and reading them.
I saw in a couple of cases where a memo was classified and you got the Defense Department to declassify it. My first reaction when I saw that is, if I want one of those, I have to go through the Freedom of Information Act to do it. Is that a little bit unfair to the outside world that you can get something declassified that I couldn't? No,
I wouldn't think so. I was, for example, U.S. Ambassador to NATO back in 1973-4. There are certain things where they just declassify after a certain period. And I was President Reagan's Middle East envoy in the 1980s, and as I talk about in the book, meeting with Saddam Hussein and those things, and a great large fractions of those things are automatically declassified. And then we had a number of the things that I dictated, of course, were classified only because they were time sensitive, and I classified them originally. And the Pentagon does this in the normal course of things, and they have.
I have a bunch of coverage sitting in my lap here, both good and bad, of your book. Mm-hmm. To start with, who made the decision to give the first interviews to ABC? And why?
I don't know why. I suppose the various networks indicated they'd like to do it, and then the publisher and people expert in all of this, which I'm not, would discuss it, and then we'd end up discussing it, and someone in the group would say, I recommend this or I recommend that, and then that would happen.
Did it have anything to do with Diane Sawyer and you working together years ago? In the
No,
Nixon
we
administration?
really never worked together. She was in the, I think, the White House press office in the Nixon administration, but no, we never worked closely together at all.
I want to run the opening to Nightline. You've worked for 4 years. All of a sudden, the book goes into the hands of the media,
Yeah.
and all this is the introduction. And I want to get your reaction.
It must be bad, or you wouldn't want to run it.
No, it's not. Have you seen this?
I have not.
Okay, let's run it and get your reaction.
Okay.
Tonight on Nightline, world exclusive. Diane Sawyer goes head-to-head with Donald Rumsfeld in a TV first. The former Secretary of Defense opens up as never before. The controversies, the wars, the WMDs, and the big question, what did he get wrong? Plus, the man whose public face has been stony defiance gets emotional for the first time about his private trials at home during his tenure at the Pentagon. An eye-opening, surprising, revelatory interview starts right now.
From the global resources of ABC News with Terry Moran, Cynthia McFadden, and Bill Weir in New York City. This is Nightline, February 7th, 2011.
So what's your reaction to the Don Rumsfeld book?
Well, I think I have seen that, or at least parts of that. You mean, I know what I think about the book. I like it.
No, but I mean the way it's treated.
The way it's treated.
The trumpets blowing. And
it sounds like it's hype. I guess they want people to watch their television show. Is why they do it that way. That's not. The book has been characterized quite differently by other people as a very serious historical book that people interested in history will read.
What's your reaction to in 2 cases they show you breaking down on camera? What's your reaction to seeing that?
Well, I don't know what my reaction is. It happened that my wife was terribly sick and almost died at one point, and we've my dad had Alzheimer's, and it's something that's hard to talk about or think about, and those are things that I'm not normally discussing, but she asked the questions and I answered them as best I could.
Have you seen Christopher Dickeys' review of your book in Bloomberg Business News?
No, I haven't.
I'll just read you what he says. He says, I've known Don Rumsfeld for 15 years, and I approached known and unknown with some trepidation. I was against the Iraq War from the outset. And then he says, known and unknown changed my mind. Rumsfeld doesn't suffer from testosterone deficit syndrome. And he comes at the reader with his jaw full out. Yet even his critics will have to strain to assert that he's dishonest. He takes his share of blame for the administration's overemphasis on WMDs. There were, he writes, many other valid reasons for taking out Saddam Hussein, among them Saddam's more than numerous violations of the UN resolutions. He makes no claims to being a PR genius and acknowledges that the old Europe crack didn't help. But he insists America did the right thing in Iraq and that he would do it again. He believes that Bush 41 should have finished the job on the first go-around. But he doesn't buy into the edible theory, much in vogue, that Bush 43 went back to upstage his old man. Now, Christopher Dickeys says he's known you for 15 years, against the war, but he likes your book. Does that surprise you?
No, I hope other people will read the book carefully. I've seen some negative comments on the book, and it sounded like they hadn't read it. But that sounds like a person who's a serious person who's read it, and that's what he thinks, and people can think what they think. That's the way our country works.
Interrupt me at any time, because I'm going to read you the Al Neuharth column from last Friday, February the 11th. Did you see that?
I haven't.
Al Neuharth's 86 years old. He was the founder of USA Today. He has a column every Friday, and he says, Don Rumsfeld, best known and remembered as President George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense before and during the Iraq War, has penned an 815-page book released this week titled Known and Unknown. It should remind us of how little we knew about Iraq and how Rumsfeld, Vice President Cheney, Bush, and others pulled the wool over our eyes.
That's just inaccurate. In the book, as I discuss at some length, think about this. Colin Powell is the one who made the presentation at the United Nations. He probably had more experience dealing with intelligence materials than anyone, including George Tenet, the director of CIA. One of the intelligence elements reported to him at the Department of State. He spent days working on it. He prepared a speech for the world which he believed every single word in it, let there be no doubt. President Bush believed every word he said, as did Vice President Cheney and Condi Rice, and as did I. I think that it is, I don't know quite how to characterize a person who would come to that conclusion when all the evidence is to the contrary. The Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, looked at the same intelligence and voted overwhelmingly for the resolution for President Bush. The political leadership in the Congress, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, John Kerry, one after another, Al Gore, were in support. Now, when things didn't go well, obviously they shifted their position somewhat. But you can go back, the record is clear. The intelligence agencies of the United Kingdom and of France and in other countries all were in agreement. And I think it's terribly unfair to suggest that anyone was pulling the wool over anyone's eyes. It's just flat not true.
Al Neuharth writes, but they said fixing the problem would be simple. Before the invasion, Rumsfeld told troops it could last, 6 days, 6 weeks. I doubt 6 months. Cheney said the conflict would be weeks rather than months.
We were talking about major combat operations, and there was nothing inaccurate there at all. And I don't know how many times I said that anyone who tells you how long it's going to last, how much it's going to cost, or how many lives will be lost is making a mistake, because people almost always are wrong.
Maureen Dowd, Donald Rumsfeld has...
You've got to be kidding.
Here we go. Donald Rumsfeld has only 815 pages, including a scintillating list of acronyms to explain why he was not responsible when stuff happened. That's an old phrase of yours. His memoir, Known and Unknown, is like a living, breathing version of the man himself. Very thorough, highly analytical, and totally absent any credible self-criticism.
False. She must not have read it. Anyone who's read it, as you have, knows that I've tried in there to talk about things that were disappointments or things that one might regret, and I did regret or do regret. I think what I've done is to try to set out not only my recollections and my opinions, but also documentation that supports it.
Do you read that stuff when you're...
No.
Don't ever?
Maureen Dowd, my goodness gracious.
Why not?
You've got to be kidding. Why would one? She has a fixation, apparently, and she's cynical. So I hope, my wife once read one, and she said, I sure hope that woman is not as cynical in all of her life as she is in her column, because it would be such an unhappy life.
So on a normal day, how do you filter information into you now that you're in civilian life?
Well, I obviously use a computer, and I listen to news programs occasionally, and I read a lot. I read newspapers.
Let me stop there, because in the early part of, and I want to go back to some of this, but in the early part of your book, you cite Whittaker Chambers as having an impact on your life.
The book Witness was an important book for whatever reason, partly because it is an important book, but also because I read it at an important time in my life. I was in college, and I watched the Army McCarthy hearings, and they had an impact on me. It was an opportunity to see the Congress going beyond its proper role.
Go back to Witness for a moment. What was it about that whole episode that...
Well, of course, the Cold War was on, and here was a man who was a communist, and a confessed communist. And the hearings, of course, in the Congress, where there was Alger Hiss on the one side, a person who'd been a clerk, as I recall, for Felix Frankfurter, and was attractive and gone to the nice schools and so forth. And you had this man who was an admitted communist who wasn't very attractive, and nobody believed him, and nobody was supporting him. And when the thing all sorted out, it turns out that Whittaker Chambers was correct, and Alger Hiss was, in fact, had known him and had been a communist. And that twist, where what everyone seemed to think wasn't the case, was helpful. And of course, it was also at the time that the Soviet Union was aggressive and expanding in several continents, there was concern about the influence of communism in the world, and I was studying government and political science in school, so it just had an effect.
Witness, you mentioned the Army McCarthy hearings. Are there other things like that that still are with you years later?
Well, Adlai Stevenson's speech at my senior banquet in college in 1954 was unquestionably a speech that was inspiring. It was elegant. It was eloquent. It was pointed to young men getting ready to go off and serve in the military, and it left me with the clear understanding that all of us have an obligation to participate and to help guide and direct our country, and civic responsibilities. And I hope people will read it. I put that speech on my website, so it might inspire other people.
I want to show you some video from 20 years ago. This was a conference on the presidency at Hofstra University on Long Island, and this is only 30 seconds. It'll speak for itself.
So many people would come up to me when I was chief of staff and say, "Rummy, this is goofy. The president's making a terrible mistake. We've simply got to get him to change his mind." And I'd say, "Terrific. I'll make an appointment. We'll go in this afternoon. Let's go on in there." We'd take the guy in there. The guy'd get all steamed up. Smoke would be coming out of his ears. He'd walk into the president's office, genuflect, kiss his ring, tell him what a wonderful job he was doing, walk out and say, "Well, that should have set him straight." Bang. They go absolutely to jelly when they walk in the Oval Office. I suppose I understand it, but I must say I found it frustrating.
How often did you see that happen?
Oh, all the time. You know, I've been collecting things I call Rumsfelds Rules. They're not really mine. They're insights of people a lot smarter than I am. And one of them is that if you have proximity to a president, you automatically have an obligation to tell them the truth and what you really believe with the bark off. Because people who don't have proximity and only go in and see him occasionally simply don't want to do it. They'll tell me and they'll say, "This is terrible, and Jerry Ford's got to do this," or, George W. Bush has to do that, and he's making a big mistake. And then you put them in there, and they just can't get it out. It's their one chance, and they want the president to know they like him and wish him well and are positive about him generally, and they don't want to use their brief moment with the president to open a wound.
Can you remember when you told the president exactly how you feel about things and didn't mince words?
Over and over and over.
Give us an example, some moment.
Well, if you go to my book, I discuss my situation with Gerald Ford. Now, that's unusual. Here was a man, the only president I've ever known who was a friend. We'd served in Congress together. As I talk about it in the book, I did help him become minority leader of the United States House of Representatives. And so we had a different kind of a relationship than one would normally have with a president. But I would walk into him over and over, and there are or will soon be memos on my website where I just say precisely what I said. And what I would do is say, "Look, I think you're doing this flat wrong. Let me tell you why." One time he was getting ready to give a speech on the WIN program, the Whip Inflation Now program, and I read it, came to me late. He'd already scheduled time for the Congress, and I read it, and I went into him, and I said, "Look, this is not good enough for a president. It simply is not going to do the job. This is too important a subject, and I urge you to cancel your speech, take 5 minutes, and simply say to the world the truth. The truth is this is an enormously important issue. The economy was in the tank, and that you're not satisfied with what the economists and your team have put together, and you're going to go back to the drawing board, and by golly, you're going to get this right." And he said, "Rummy, I think this is a good program, and I'm going to go ahead and do it." And I told him, "Well, you're going to make a whale of a mistake." And he did. He went out, and it was laughed at, the WIN program, and the buttons that said WIN, and the bumper stickers.
Well, I remember the
Do you remember this?
Sure.
Oh, my goodness.
Whip Inflation Now.
Yeah.
Let me show you a picture of you and Jerry Ford. You can see it on the monitor there.
Yeah.
He's waving, and you're off to the right. What's the story there?
That was in San Francisco, and this woman, Sarah Jane Moore, was just across the street, a normal street size, his car was right in front of him, and we came out together, and he had, an elevator had come down and hit his head and scarred his head. And of course he was being teased by folks about bumping his head and stumbling and so forth. He was one of the best athletes that ever served in that office. And so I said to him, look, we were up in the hotel room, and I said, look, when you come out, we don't want to have Chevy Chase have a big fun at your expense about the fact you bumped your head again. Come out, walk fast, wave, and just get right in the car, and we'll get out to the airport. Well, he came out, and the bullet, she shot a bullet, went right by his head, right by my head, right by the Secret Service man's head into the wall of the St. Francis Hotel. And we pushed him in the back seat of the car, and the Secret Service guy and I were on top of him, and the car sped out of town. And 6-8 blocks later, you could hear a muffled thing, come on, Rummy, you guys get off, you're heavy. So, and fortunately, he wasn't hit. But it was the second time that he'd been, someone had tried to assassinate him in California. The other was in Sacramento, in the park as we were walking in to see Governor Jerry Brown.
Is Squeaky Fromm?
Yeah, that was Squeaky Fromm.
Both of these women still in prison?
No, they let Sarah Jane Moore out, and I'm not sure about Squeaky Fromm. She got out and said she's sorry she missed, and she wanted to create chaos, this Sarah Jane Moore.
What does that do to you, a near miss, and to him?
Well, we got him a bulletproof vest finally, and he wore it, I think, twice. But for me, what it told me was it's practically impossible to protect a person. You know, if you're a politician and you're out seeing people and doing things and around, the person who tries to do it can be killed or captured, generally. But it's just not possible to protect a person, you know, 24 hours a day against every conceivable type of attack.
One of the things we learn in your book is a lot about connections, people you knew, and I want to run another clip from that session you had, which will get us to the next section. I want to talk about business and government.
Mm-hmm.
As in business, I think success in government requires an orientation to the customer. The only reason for government to exist is to serve the people. It's important for people in the White House to remember that. I don't know quite why it is that fact is so easily overlooked. I suppose in business, if you overlook it, you go out of business. But in government, it just goes on and on and on.
How many years in business? G.D. Searle?
Oh, more than 20. I was chief executive of Searle and General Instrument Corporation, and then chairman of Gilead Sciences over the years.
How would you characterize the difference between running a business, for-profit business, stock market, the whole thing, and running a government agency like the Department of Defense?
In business, if you do poorly, the business goes out of business. It ends. And government doesn't end. Government can do quite poorly over a long, long, long period of time, and it just goes on and on and on. Another thing about business is, you know, human beings, and unless you're Einstein or Mozart and you go off and all by yourself and do something brilliant, all the rest of us who aren't Einsteins or Mozarts, what we do is with other people. So in business, you just lay out a course of action, try it, get people to help you do it. If the people do well, you reward them. If the people don't do well, you get other people to help do it. And if it does well, you encourage it and keep it going. If it doesn't do well, you stop it. In government, it's quite different. In government, for example, when I was running the Office of Economic Opportunity, we would try something, and before we could even get it going, the Congress wanted an oversight hearing. People wanted to have an inspector general's report on it. People kept pulling it up by the roots to see how it was doing, and that's the first way to kill something. We tried, for example, educational vouchers. We tried certain type of family assistance in welfare, performance contracting in education. but no one would let them really be there long enough to see if they would work. They always wanted to examine it, debate it, discuss it, which in the case of business isn't the case at all. You can go out and try something. If it doesn't work, you stop it. If something doesn't work in government, well, my goodness, there are investigations, you made a big mistake, everything's horrible. And so the chances of having something succeed in business are vastly greater. In government, because of something doesn't ever end, it doesn't have to stop if it doesn't work well. That's not the case.
The day we're taping this, Monday, February 14th, this article in USA Today, right here it says, the challenge of belt tightening. Pentagon has tried for years to drop alternative engine for F-35, yet lawmakers refuse to cancel the program.
Yeah.
You saw this up close, and you talk about something called the Iron Triangle in your book. First of all, what's the Iron Triangle? Then I want to ask you about things like this.
The Iron Triangle, as I characterize it, is the fact that the bureaucracy in the Department of Defense, military and civilian, is relatively permanent. It's there. The defense contractors, that's an institution that exists in our society, is relatively permanent. It's there. And the Congress of the United States, the members and their staffs change relatively little in any given election cycle. And the three of them get together and develop a comfort level as to what ought to be. Now, if somebody comes in then and wants to change that, namely a president of the United States gets elected, and he has views. So take President George W. Bush. He gave a speech at the Citadel. He outlined what he thought ought to happen, how the Department of Defense could be brought into the 21st century. And any changes that are made tend to be made over the objection of the Congress, the defense contractors, and the permanent bureaucracy. They're comfortable with the way it is. They've concluded that that's the way it ought to be. And if a president gets elected and comes into office with different views, there tends to be natural opposition to it. I canceled, for example, the Crusader program. I can't think of a worse name in this environment we're in than the Crusader, but it was an enormous artillery piece that took 2 aircraft to move anywhere in the world. Certainly not something that was appropriate for the 21st century and the asymmetric warfare that we're facing. And the opposition to it was just incredible. I mean, the retired community in the Army, the active duty community in the Army, the civilian contractors, the Congress. I'll give you an example, just a data point. When I was Secretary of Defense in the 70s, the Defense Authorization Bill was 74 pages long. When I came back in the year 2001, if I'm not mistaken, the Defense Authorization Bill was over 500 pages. So what happened is, in the intervening period, the staffs in Congress ballooned. They went up by a multiple of 2 or 3. The continuing layering of requirements from the Congress, generally stimulated either by the defense community or stimulated by the bureaucracy because they want to perpetuate something, ends up with rule, requirement, reports, all of these things. Hundreds of reports are required by the Department of Defense. Hundreds of letters have to be answered for all kinds of detailed things. And the movement away from legislative oversight of a broad, substantive nature, which would be very constructive if hearings were held on important things, going down not to big, broad issues, but down to micro management of the thing. The closest thing I can think of is Gulliver's. Do you remember Gulliver's Travels? And the Lilliputians would put threads over Gulliver. Gulliver was big and strong, and the thread, no one of those threads made any difference. It wasn't a problem, or 2 or 5 or 10 or hundreds. But when you put hundreds of these threads over Gulliver, he couldn't get up. And that's basically what's happening in government to the Department of Defense.
Let me read the first paragraph. It says, for 5 years running, 2 presidents have tried to eliminate funding for a backup engine on a fighter jet, a program Defense Secretary Robert Gates calls unnecessary. And it goes in here to the details of how much money these industries like General Electric and others are giving to the members of Congress. And the members, a former OMB director, Rob Portman, has written up in here about receiving something like $59,000 from GE over for the 2010 elections. And I guess my main point to find out from you is how can we, with the trouble we're in economically, how is this ever going to stop when the Defense Department, who needs these weapons, says no and the Congress says yes?
I mean, every year there was another, I don't know, it was 10 or 12 billion dollars that the Congress added to our legislation that we didn't want, that we argued, please don't put that in there. It's for things that had nothing to do with the defense budget. Now, the implication of your question is, sure, we've got serious economic problems in this country, but there's no way to balance this budget off the Defense Department. I mean,
my implication. How do we stop this throughout government?
Exactly, it's broad because I mean the entitlements is basically where the money goes. It's the largest fraction. We're spending today a relatively small percentage of our GDP on defense compared to, for example, back in the Eisenhower and Kennedy era, we were spending I think 10%. We're now down into the 3 and 4% in that area of GDP.
I want to put something up on the screen because while you were off being Secretary of Defense, we were getting phone calls on our call-in show every day about this. And you allude to it in your book, but you don't talk specifically about it. What I have here is a January 26, 1998 letter that you signed.
98?
98, when you were a civilian.
Right.
And you signed it, and I wanted to ask about, because, well, read it, and you'll see why. This was to President Clinton, and we'll show you in a minute the list of people who signed it. You say here, the only acceptable strategy is one that eliminates the possibility that Iraq will be able to use or threaten to use weapons of mass destruction. In the near term, this means a willingness to undertake military action as diplomacy is clearly failing. 98 now, you're not in government. In the long term, it means removing Saddam Hussein and his regime from power. That now needs to become the aim of American foreign policy. We urge you to articulate this aim and to turn your administration's attention to implementing a strategy for removing Saddam's regime from power. This will require a full complement of diplomatic, political, and military efforts. Although we are fully aware of the dangers and difficulties in implementing this policy, we believe the dangers of failing to do so are far greater. We believe the U.S. has the authority under the existing UN resolutions to take the necessary steps, including military steps, to protect our vital interests in the Gulf. Last sentence. In any case, American policy cannot continue to be crippled by a misguided insistence on unanimity in the UN Security Council. Now, if you look over on this screen, you will see who signed it. And those people on the right, all those people were out of government at the time. Then in the administration of George Bush, they come in. National Security Council there with Mr. Khalilzad. Bill Kristol had Weekly Standard. Richard Pearl was the head of the Defense Policy Board. There you are, Donald Rumsfeld, heading up the Defense Department. I guess is, in so many ways, this letter, which was a project for a new American century, you were successful.
It's interesting because that was in 1998, and the Democratic Congress passed a resolution that made the policy of the United States of America regime change in Iraq, and President Clinton agreed with it and signed it. So there was broad agreement in both political parties back in the 90s that there was, I mean, here you had a country that was on the State Department's terrorist list. You had a country that had invaded Kuwait. You had a country that had engaged in a long war with Iran. You had a country that was shooting at American airplanes almost every day as the UK and the US aircraft patrolled the no-fly zones in the northern and southern part of Iraq. And you had a country that had rejected, I think, eventually some 17 UN resolutions. So I don't think it's surprising that a number of people in both political parties held that view.
Well, but by and large, these are the people that moved into the administration, had that view before they got in the administration.
But it was broadly supported by the Democrats and by President Clinton.
No, I don't question that. It just seems to me that it was interesting that this outfit was set up by I think Robert Kagan and Bill Crystal. The office was located at the Weekly Standard, but here all of you were together then, and I just wondered if you remember why you signed that letter and what the circumstances were around it. Because people called us all the time and said, we should have known this was coming because these guys all agreed to it beforehand.
Interesting, yeah.
I mean, it's whether it's a conspiracy or whether it's actually it happened.
How can it
it happen?
Conspiracy? It's a matter of public record. It's people said it publicly, and President Clinton agreed, and the Democratic House and Senate agreed. I mean, how could anyone use the word conspiracy?
Well, you probably hadn't heard some of our callers. I mean, but the point that I want to get you to talk about is the idea that all of you knew each other then. You agreed on that point, then you came into government. It's no surprise that you carried that out.
I had no intention of coming back in government, you can be sure of that. That was a big surprise for me. Well, I mean, President George W. Bush did not sign that.
No, he did not. But Dick Cheney signed the original letter and the year before, setting up the whole project for a new American century.
Is that right?
So you had Richard Armitage over at State, and you saw the list.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I would say is that President Bush did not sign. He was the president. He is the one who made the decision, and I think that using the word conspiracy, I think, Brian, is a real unfortunate thing.
Yeah, I'm not using that word.
There are people who, there are people who say things like that, but there is not any shred of legitimacy to the use of that word.
All right, here is an odd and an end I want to ask you about. This comes out of an interview that I did with a fellow named Rowan Scarborough, a book about you. And I'll run this, and you tell us finally what is true and what is not true. Let's run this. No, I can't be the first person to tell you that the first thing I learned in here that surprised me was that Donald Rumsfeld is a close friend of Dan Rather's and co-owns a ranch with him somewhere.
Yes,
Where did you find that?
Well, when I was interviewing Rumsfeld's friends, one of them just mentioned, by the way, I think he and Dan Rather own property together in New Mexico. So I said, oh, that's an interesting tidbit. Dan Rather is not a particular ally of Republicans, and Rumsfeld is a lifelong Republican. So I called Rumsfeld's aide, and he said to me, I think that's urban legend. I don't think that's true. 2 days later, he comes back and says, yeah, they own a ranch together in Teos, New Mexico. So they met during the Nixon administration when Rather covered the White House, and they've just remained friends, very close friends ever since.
You want the facts?
Yes, sir.
The facts are these. I didn't know Dan Rather, and we were not close friends. Our children went to school together in Washington, D.C., and our wives were close friends, and Dan and I became friends. I was not because of, he was covering the White House. I was in government, but I didn't deal with him from a press standpoint at all. It was more of a neighborhood type thing. And at a certain point, it was not Taos, New Mexico. It was, I can't remember the name of the town. It's over east of Santa Fe. And we owned a ranch there. There were 5 of us, I think, who owned the ranch. Just different people, had different relationships, and it was kind of we never used it much. It was an investment. And I've known Dan over the years, and I haven't seen him in ages. My wife Joyce sees Gene from time to time.
So do you still have an ownership at all?
No, that was in the 70s and 80s. It's been, I'm going to guess, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years since we've had that ranch. Oh, it's near Las Vegas, New Mexico.
New Mexico.
Yeah, not Las Vegas, Nevada.
Embedding of journalists in the Iraq War. At one point, there were 775 journalists and photographers. Whose idea was it?
I don't know precisely. I know who I heard it first from, and it was Torre Clark, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs. And she'd been working with her staff and various people discussing it, whether it was a good idea, whether it wasn't a good idea. And at some moment, she came to General Myers, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and me, and said that she believed that this would be a good idea, that we could allow journalists to go right into the units that were fighting a war in Afghanistan and eventually in Iraq, and let them see for themselves what the men and women in uniform were doing and how they were doing it. And now, the downside to that obviously is if you have journalists embedded in your units, you have to protect them, you have to feed them, you have to transport them and move them around. And you don't want them saying things that would put our troops in jeopardy by revealing what was going to be done next or that type of thing. And Torre was persuasive, and eventually Dick Myers and I both liked the idea, and we agreed, and she set about doing it and did it very, very well. And I think that an awful lot of young journalists, men and women, were willing to put themselves at risk, and you have to credit them for that. They had a chance to see how truly magnificent the men and women in uniform are, the wonderful job they do, how well they do it, how professional they are, how proud they are of what they do, and that they are good people. They're people that live next door to all of us, and so we decided that was a good idea. We did it, and for some long period, it worked rather well.
You remember probably how the media covered Vietnam.
Yes.
And now you've been through this.
Yeah.
If the Secretary of Defense comes to you in the future and says, what should I do? We're faced with this again. Would you recommend embedding to him?
I would. I think that an awful lot of the journalists have never served in the military. And I think they probably, regardless of what they wrote or what they saw or what their editors wanted them to write, they saw how truly wonderful these young men and women are who volunteer to serve our country. And I think that's good, because these people in journalism have a responsibility. They're going to be writing for the rest of their lives, probably. And if they inside know that these people are good people, that they're decent and that they're hardworking and that they're brave and that they're trying to do what's right, sure, do people in the military make mistakes? You bet. Will they see things that are going to be not positive for the military or for the administration or for the armed forces generally? Yes, they will. Do they get pressure from their editors who are competing to sell newspapers or get advertising people to support their television programs? Yeah, they get pressure. And the old story is, if it bleeds, it leads. And sometimes people get in a hurry and they want to have it fast but not right. But can you live with that? Sure. I would recommend they do it.
You mentioned Torre Clark, and there is one little story in here where she is mentioned, and it's two reasons I want to bring it up. One, you're the Secretary of Defense, and you have a relationship with everybody else in the Defense Department on a level of, you're the Mr. Secretary, I assume. Did anybody call you Don?
Oh, some friends do.
In the Pentagon?
Oh, sure.
And they call you Rummy and all that. Well, the story I want to ask you about is the Torre Clark story, the day of 9/11. Mm-hmm. You'd been rescuing people, and you'd been at the Pentagon until 11 o'clock at night, and she asked you if you'd called your wife. Do you remember this?
I do. First, when you say I've been rescuing people, I was out there a very short period of time. I went out to see what had happened. I helped out briefly and got right back to my office. I do. It was, I don't know what time it was, 10:30 or something at night.
You say 11 in the book.
11 at night.
Yeah.
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 And we'd had a tough day, and the country had had a tough day, and hundreds and indeed thousands of people had been killed. Our building was smoking and burning, and they were still pulling people out of the charred remains of that area where the American Airlines plane hit our building. And I'd gone back to the office, and we were trying to sort through. I wanted to keep the building open. I didn't want the terrorists to shut us down, and we were trying to see if that would be possible and that type of thing. And at some moment, she looked at me and said, "Have you called Mrs. R?" And I just said no. And she blurted out, "Not Mr. Secretary, not sir." she just blurted out, "You son of a bitch." And it was a stunner. And I don't know what I said, but I probably said, "You've got a point." But I've talked to Joyce about that since, my wife, and she said it never crossed her mind. We've been married, 56 years now? That was a decade ago, 46 years or something. She said she knew where I was. She was hearing reports. I knew where she was. She'd been at the Defense Intelligence Agency with a bunch of defense attachés getting a briefing. And she didn't have any doubt in her mind but that I had things I had to do. And so it was not a problem. Torre was looking at it, Torre Clark was looking at it as a wife and a spouse, and it was a perfectly understandable reaction, I suppose. And I don't know what I said, but I probably said, Torre, I think you got a point.
That's what you said in the book.
Is that right? Yeah.
Presidents you've worked around and observed over the years. Now, this is not about politics. This is which president, in your experience, was the best suited to run the country? Not from a public relations standpoint, but from because you talk a lot in this book about systems, White House systems, and the different meetings and all that you had. But which one do you think was best equipped to run the country?
You have to appreciate that they were all very different. We have to remind ourselves that the times they served were notably different. So the skill sets or the backgrounds that might be most beneficial at one period might not be quite as beneficial in another. And they also were different at different stages of their presidency. If they served over time, they might have come in with some strengths and weaknesses, and as it evolved, those weaknesses might have very well disappeared and their strengths became greater. So it's a hard question to answer. I think that from the time he was there, the fact that Gerald R. Ford had such basic human decency and was so naturally a human being that people could appreciate, I think that coming in as he did when the reservoir of trust had been drained in our country, following the only president in our history to resign, was a terribly difficult thing, and I think he helped heal the country, and that was important. I mean, Ronald Reagan unquestionably had a strategic sense that was directionally correct by my standard, and enormously helpful to our country in terms of ending the Cold War. He did an awful lot that was right, and I mean, Dwight Eisenhower had a largely successful presidency. Richard Nixon, my goodness, an enormously talented man with a wonderful mind and a seriousness of purpose, and brought an enormously talented team of people into government who affected the course of government for decades thereafter. People like Henry Kissinger and Bill Steinman and Alan Greenspan and so many others.
We're out of time, but why did you not take the job of the committee to re-elect the president under Richard Nixon back in '72?
I was interested in the substantive side of government as opposed to the political side, and I just didn't have any interest in doing it.
We're out of time. The book is called Known and Unknown, a memoir. Donald Rumsfeld is our guest. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.